Hello, Christoph. So we are here. I'm sitting in Venice in my office at Department of Economics, Ca' Foscari University, and I presume you are in Munich. So some 5 hours distance by car, but we are all together here in the screen. So um, are you in fact in Munich now?
Yes, Carlo, I'm in Munich, and it's 5 hours by car, and I think it's about six days by bicycle. I once went from across the Alps by bicycle to Venice. I enjoyed that trip. It was hard, but I enjoyed it.
Okay. I will try to double check if it is in fact that long by bicycle when I can. Anyway, Um, I know you had some studies. You studied poetry, in particular, you had the first doctorate about poetry. Um, but I know you as an expert on the environment. So why are you now working on the environment?
Uh, that's a good question, and I think that when you're older, you always create your own past. Probably today, I would say, well, I was always interested in the environment. I grew up with a view of a goat stable and a vineyard and a forest and some chains of hills, and I enjoyed that. And the forest became a nature park when I was a teenager, and later on, I was taking part in some environmental demonstrations. But I don't know when my real interest started. Can tell you, you're right. I started with poetry. My first doctorate was in poetry. And my second doctorate, the habilitation, was on secret intelligence. So for a long time, I was doing political history, and I was actually living in Washington, D.C., working on political topics, transatlantic, Germany, America, all the time. But one day, I decided to write a book about forests. But I became the director of the German Historical Institute and didn't have the time to write the book about forests. And so instead, I invited environmental historians to the institute. It was a hobby, really. And we organized 10 or more big international conferences or workshops on topics such as landscapes and roads, rivers in history. We did the first international conference on green parties around the globe, etc. Mm-hmm. But I really loved it. And I thought this was much more interesting than political history, than intelligence history. And so when I returned to Germany after a very long time from America, I decided to continue on that track. I also felt this was something valuable, something much more important for our future than diplomatic history, to understand our relationship with nature.
I see.
So, but Carlo, you're an economist, and perhaps you can tell me how you got interested in the environment. You're now running at your university environmental humanities courses. Can you tell me what sparked your interest?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I can say is that I always feel uncomfortable when I'm labeled somehow as an economist or as something else. I had a rather eclectic career, I would say, which is not that different from what you described before. So I did many different things, but probably I can say very easily that environment has been for me sort of fil rouge connecting all these different activities that I carried out and studies more or less, because studying is what I'm really interested in. And my interpretation of the environment has always been founded and driven by the interest for complex systems. So the idea of being able to really understand what are causal links, what determines what we see, what is behind. And of course, on all these cases, the nice and stimulating thing is trying to understand how we can combine different competencies and different knowledge, to solve the problems we are facing. I've been involved in so many projects, European projects, national projects, regional projects, and I find always very fascinating the initial stage in which you meet new people, new experts. You really do not understand each other at the very beginning, and you develop a common language. You develop sort of a process of mutual learning, and in particular, also, I think my attitudes are not really to go very deeply into the very details of the things, but probably in comparative ways, so to say, I see that I have some capability, so to say, to understand the others, those that speak different languages. So I developed upon this, and and the experience at VIU is in that direction.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing at VIU. You're now starting with the environmental humanities classes. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're the dean at VIU, Venice International University, a conglomerate of many international universities. My university here in Munich, LMU, is also part of it. Can you tell us a little bit about the environmental humanities in Venice and your university?
This idea, first of all, we must give credit to Shaul, our friend Shaul Bassi, who stimulated really very much this idea of bringing this topic, if not discipline, here in Venice somehow. And at VIU, as you said, we are an association of 20 universities, and indeed your university, LMU, is one of the most active. We always have colleagues from LMU here in Venice. And in general, what we do is organizing joint activities. So activities in which we have contribution from many different institutions, universities. So this is really a very good basis for developing something about environmental humanities. But I have also prepared a picture of the island that maybe we can share with our audience and see how nice the place is, and therefore this little island in front of San Marco Square, more or less, in the lagoon of Venice. So this is also really a place where you can develop new ideas, and all the people coming to San Servolo Island, they always have this idea of a place where you can really think and develop new ideas. So this was also the case for environmental humanities. We have recently organized a graduate seminar with contribution from your university, from Ca' Foscari University, Tel Aviv, Boston College. So there we really had some, at least for me, initial brainstorming about this topic. Shaul probably had already in mind this idea of a new master course at Ca' Foscari. So we have now these parallel efforts that are all somehow converging to this topic of environmental humanities. And if I may say, from my viewpoint, it is indeed, it goes in line with my traditional curiosity. and more or less I interpret as let's say a manifestation of the growing interest for the environment by scholars who do not belong to art sciences, so humanities, but also social sciences. And this is good, because I think we have really big questions, we have big challenges, and we cannot really find solutions with a disciplinary approach. We have to go beyond our, as we call it, silos or silos of disciplinary knowledge. But I know also you have a very interesting story to share about your center, because you are funding director of the Carson Center in Munich, and I think you started in 2009 this effort. So why don't you tell us also something about your center?
Yeah, maybe I can also show you a picture of Munich. This is the view from the south. So if you, so we are sitting basically in the south. So we are sitting in the mountains in the Alps. So you can't see the mountains. You must imagine them in the south. We're looking northwards, and you can see the green strip. There's a long green strip, which is in part, the Isar River, and in part the English Garden, one of the largest urban parks. And I'm showing this image of Munich rather than the Rachel Carson Center's image, because there's not that much. It's not that fascinating. I'm sitting in a modern building. It's quite nice, but the best part of our building is probably the library with its leather armchairs, and I'm very proud of our library. But you asked what our center is about, and our center, I think I can explain has really four arms. The first arm is we are a center for advanced study, which means we've invited hundreds, in fact, more than 300 postdocs and professors to come here over the last 11 years since we founded it. More than 300 to write books and articles. They've stayed here for many months, some of them for a year or longer. A second part of the Carlson Center is a research institute. We're a research institute with third-party funding, like you just mentioned, your EU grants. And we have multiple research projects on small and large, on topics like national parks in in transnational perspective, environmentalism, the waste economy, global waste economy, about toxicity around the globe. We've got a project coming up about Ebola and diseases around the globe, and about COVID. So we're doing many, many different things. And like you, we are very interdisciplinary. So the third part of our center is a graduate school. I think you could call it a graduate school. We started a structured doctoral program with about 35 doctoral students from many different disciplines. We have a PhD in environmental humanities, among others. And we have a certificate for MA students in environmental studies. They come from every discipline at LMU and other Bavarian universities, 130 students who do environmental studies. And we're just now starting a master in environmental humanities. Actually, we're not calling it a master in environmental humanities. We call it differently. And we have the fourth arm. We have an outreach. We are very much an outreach institution. We're an institution that has a partnership with the Deutsches Museum and does film screenings and public events, etc.
Well, of course, I'm curious to know why you decided not to call it environmental humanities. I mean, you're master and you went for a different title.
Yeah, you caught me on that. We asked for funding for a master in environmental humanities. We got funding, but the funding organization, the FAWEG Foundation, said, well, this is really not a discipline, environmental humanities. And I have to admit that I was not unhappy when they said that, because we asked our students, the environmental studies students, would you have studied what you're now doing if it had been called environmental humanities? And almost all of them said no, it doesn't appeal to them. And so I think there are a few groups that we interviewed who said this is not ideal. The one group was the historians. They said, well, environmental humanities to us sounds very much like literature. The literary eco-critics call themselves very often environmental humanities scholars and environmental philosophers as well. And the other group are scientists. They feel excluded. And what is perhaps central to our master, was going to be central to our master that we're establishing, and we're establishing MOOCs, massive open online courses. What is central for us is that we focus on the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. So we want to be really integrative.
I see. Well, terminology is always very stimulating, actually, and it would be nice to compare our experiences in the coming years and see how this local idea about the new masters develops and how your idea develops, and see what is different. But again, in terms of names, why don't you tell us about the name of your center, the Rutger Carlson Center? Why this name?
Yeah, it's a name of an American in Germany, but it's an international center, and we've had the postdocs and professors came from 60 different countries. The idea behind it was to internationalize environmental studies in Germany. So I didn't want a German name. I didn't want a German male name. We've got the Goethe Institutes, we've got the Leibniz Society, we've got the Humboldt Foundation. All these German men, everybody names their institutes after German men. I didn't like that. And so I really liked Rachel Carson, first of all, because she's internationally visible. At one point we did a competition, an essay competition, and the junior winner came from Nepal, and the senior winner was a professor in literature from America. And we realized that the name rings a bell around the globe. We even got responses from Réunion and from Japan and from New Zealand and from Trinidad Tobago. A conservation society read Rachel Carson and they changed into an environmentalist organization. So we liked that as well, that here's an American woman who is a great scientist, but has transformed politics in America by making sure that pesticides would be forbidden, DDT would be forbidden. So we liked the name recognition, the internationally visible figure, the fact that she's a scientist, but she can speak to a broader public.
I see.
Paolo, I want to know something from you. You've asking me all these questions. I really want to know something from you, and I'm stuck with. I understand it a little bit. We have this in common that we are a bit. I call myself a dilettante because we have to be a dilettante when you call it complexity and you call it a broad interest. I think we all have a broad interest when we're environmental studies scholars. But when I think of economists and when the economists I'm dealing with here at the LMU, when they talk about the environment, they talk about natural resources. And that seems to be very limiting. So can you tell me a little bit more about your approach? And, are you an unorthodox economist being interested in the environment? Tell us a little bit. Enlighten us.
Orthodox is not really the right attribute for me. And it's developing, at least for me, is a very nice meeting between a dilettante, as you said, and a curious person. If we have to give us probably a label. Anyway, no, I would say that the paradigms are always evolving, and indeed, when you think about environmental economics in strict sense, what you should have in mind is, in fact, the branch of neoclassical economics, which developed upon two main problems. One is resource management, the management of natural resources, and the other one is pollution. And this, of course, can be easily understood as two economic issues in terms of costs related to pollution, negative impacts, and of course benefits coming from the exploitation of natural resources. In fact, this idea is still very strong because still we have a mainstream in economics that is based upon neoclassical economics. But paradigms, as I said, are evolving, and I have also a picture to show, simply because I am a fan of graph, and I always tend to think and speak with graphs. What I just described is on the left-hand side, and this is the classical two boxes. No, this is when you find this picture, you know that you are reading a book written by a neoclassical economist. You have the environment and the economy; they are connected by some arrows expressing the exchanges in between the two things: raw materials, amenities, as we say in economics, and wastes that come the opposite way from the economy to the environment as a waste sink, as we say. But on the right-hand side, I took this from a book instead of Introduction to Ecological Economics. We don't have time to go into a precise description of the difference between these two interpretations of the economics of the environment. But there on the right, you see very easily how this idea of complexity that I mentioned before can be used to not anymore have two blocks somehow interacting and exchanging things, but as a system, a complex system which has internal elements, which has exchanges with what is outside, typically energy, the sun, and so on. And this rather simple, I would say, picture could be really a basis for developing that kind of discourse that I mentioned before, and that kind of exchanges between different disciplines that I mentioned before, based on this idea of systems, system interpretation, system dynamics, system analysis. And as you can see here, the environment and the society are not anymore two blocks separated somehow connected. They are the society is within the environment. So it's a kind of Cartesian revolution in understanding of the relationship between humans and the environment. The socio-economic system is part of a broader system, which is the ecosystem, and the joint system can be called as a social ecological system, or more concisely as a social ecosystem, which is another term that allows you to label probably the literature that you read. When you read this term, you understand that those authors are inspired by these ambitions, so to say, of being able to understand the complexity of these interconnected systems.
Okay, well, I like that graph, and I can see why you point out the complexity issue. And I really want to go back to that graph at one point. We just don't have the time, but maybe I would like to attend classes with you to learn more and to challenge you on some of these things about, where the environment is in society or society is in the environment, and how the economies relate to both of them. But I like it, the way you depict it. Let me ask you, because the environmental humanities and what we are discussing here in this series is very much interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, but it's also interdisciplinary. And I think probably we all have our favorite discipline that, like a sparring partner discipline, which ones that we would love to work with more, which ones we see will have a future in general and are important for humankind, but also, which ones we like to work with. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, in my case, I started my career at the Faculty of Agricultural Sciences in Padua. So I have this kind of background that is still with me, and how can I say? I feel younger when I deal with agriculture, forestry, and this kind of what we call agro-ecosystem, for example. So those kind of, and I always consider those systems as probably iconic and emblematic systems where we can really understand the relationship between humans and nature and the environment. And personally, anyway, I'm interested, I would say, as a curious person, as an eclectic person, as I said before, in all the disciplines that are relevant for dealing with the environmental issues. Think about sociology, for example, how important it is to have an understanding of the social systems when we carry out, for example, social network analysis to understand power relationship between the actors that are relevant for managing a very important area, a place where we have an environmental relevance, or behavioral sciences, for example. These, I think, are disciplines that we have to, how to say, exploit more in the future for learning about the environment. Mm-hmm. So at least this is, but what about you? What is your view, and how, I mean, as an historian and with your interest about humanities, you think you and your colleagues can contribute to these studies, and what you think about the disciplines, as you asked me before?
Well, I think maybe many years ago I would have been interested in physics, among the sciences. I think, probably when I was young, I would, everybody was thinking about space and time and astronomy and stuff. I don't think that physics is something that fascinates me anymore. But I think that biology is something that is a discipline that we should be much more interested in. Microbiology, I think, we are changing our bodies. We've been learning much more about other creatures and, more than human relationships. So I think biology will be where we will see many, many changes, also dangerous changes. We're changing animals into, we can reproduce ourselves. So understanding, the environment through biology is something that really, really fascinates me. But, we recently did an exhibition on Munich, and I realized when I'm talking to my students and when we do excursions out in nature, and we do a lot of that, then the students often say, well, geology is what really interests us, and yeah.
I see. But you mentioned this exhibition that you did. Can you tell us something more about this exhibition? What it was?
Yeah,
it was about.
And yeah, maybe on a slide. I mean, I can show you some of the questions that we were dealing with. Here's here are some questions. Difficult to read, but you can see this is Munich. You can see a windmill. You can see the Olympic Stadium, which was really built on a waste mountain. But you can also, one of the topics that we dealt with in this exhibition that students prepared, what I really like about this is that students from many different disciplines would work, let's say, on a river, from the biologists who are interested in ornithology, anthropologists who look at, or sociologists who look at life in Munich, historians who study how Munich has been shaped. And in this exhibition, it became clear that geology plays a role. If you think of Munich, you think of beer, and Munich people are proud to say, we are a green city, and we have the best water. But to understand why this happens has a lot to do with the geology, with the with the Alps that were created. And when the Alps were created, the rivers were flowing down, and that good water is coming down for that reason. The beer can be stored in the type of landscape that we have in Munich. South of Munich, you can't grow anything properly. North of Munich, you can. All that has a lot to do with the geology. So I'm intrigued by all this, and we studied Munich from many different perspectives. Munich likes to see itself as a green city, and likes to say that in the future, we will be climate neutral, etc. But let me just ask you something, because you are Mr. Professor Future in a way for me, because I know you are studying, you're modeling, and modelers are always not thinking about the moment, but they are thinking about what's going to happen in the future. Can you introduce us into the secret of your futuristic science?
Well, when I first met you and we started the discussion, and I know I had to deal with an historian, which was something strange to me. I was in fact thinking, starting from this idea that I am working about the future and you're working about the past. So probably if we have time, it would be nice to go into some details. But as you said, I mean, yes, indeed, when you speak about climate change, at least by tradition, you speak about the future. And this is really something that we had really to go deeply into the understanding of what this means. I take the opportunity to mention a concept that I think is returning to our attention very much in recent times, but we should really consider very carefully, which is sustainable development. Of course, sustainable development can be a buzzword, but it is also a crucial concept that allows us to think about the future. So for me, sustainable development and climate change are exactly the same thing. When you think about future generation, as you should do, thinking about sustainable development, you have to take into consideration all the drivers of change. And of course, climate is one of the most important drivers of change, which can, in fact, change dramatically our lives in a future that is not that far anymore. And it's a future which is full of uncertainty. So we really have to develop new understanding, new languages, and new tools and new methods for approaching this kind of problems, the challenges that I mentioned before. And modeling, of course, plays a very important role, because I repeat always to all my students, maybe you don't know, but you model all times. When you think about simply taking a very stupid decision like switching the heating off or on, it is because you have a model in your mind that tells you that if you do that action, you will receive some sort of benefit from that action. And this means that you have the capacity to make a sort of projection in the near future, of course, and not in the far future, of what could be the consequences of your action. This is a mental model, and what we usually try to do is to convert this mental model into some sort of set of mathematical equations, so mathematical models. And what we obtain here, I have prepared a picture that I would like to show and share with you, and also having your reactions about that. You see, this is a classical IPCC picture, the picture of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We are somewhere at the end of the solid black line, and then the so-called spaghetti graph start. So many divergent trajectories about possible futures that can be possible, in fact, that are, as we say, plausible, depending on some assumptions, some hypotheses that we can make about the future. And what is evident here is that the future is uncertain, while the past is certain instead. And this, I think, is also an interesting element for our discussion, if you like. Maybe if you want to react, I don't know, immediately to that, it would be interesting and nice.
Yeah. It's funny that you say, oh, the history is very simple and the future is very complex. Of course, you have provoked me here, and I think you've also provoked me, and I wish I could talk about it when you talk about sustainability, is climate change. And I'm not sure, whether sustainability is an important term. It's a very conservative term. You want to sustain. But I also would disagree that the past is so simple. I mean, what as historians study is always, the optionality. At any point in time, you can go back to ancient times. You can go back to the Old Testament. The prophets would say, if you do such and such, then such and such will happen. And it could be doom or gloom or a happy future. So at any point, historians look at why did things happen at a certain point, and why did other things not happen? So we have this graph in mind. So we're very similar. We always think about the historical future as well. So I think we have a lot in common. We should continue this discussion.
Sure, we can. Well, yes, I think also another element that could be stimulating is this idea of this combination of a verbal narrative description of things and models. This is also another element that, for example, in climate change, we use the term storyline. A storyline for us is really a description of how the future may unfold, which could be the basis for defining, for example, alternative scenarios. And this is another interesting concept on which we could develop somehow. That is the idea of using future with the plural form, because we don't see a single future. We see multiple possible or plausible futures, and in order to describe this, we need narratives. So we need these so-called storylines, and we typically want to develop this into more quantitative descriptions of how the future may unfold by means of mathematical models, of course. But as you said, I mean, I know historians, and you in particular, are not simply dealing with the past, So and you are also dealing with the future, but also maybe now we can move to a specific interest of your research that I think can be very stimulating, which is your interest for natural catastrophe, which I think is an interesting case, maybe to learn from the past, but also to plan for the future. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, I think natural catastrophes are particularly interesting when you look, and I would agree that, and I'm happy you pointed out. I think historians, they believe, many don't, but I do, and especially environmental historians believe that we can analyze a past situation and learn for the future about it. I mean, natural catastrophe. Think of Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Betsy. In 1965, there was a hurricane that was much worse than Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So 50 years are between these two catastrophes. And a lot of money has been spent to build up dams and to protect areas from flooding. But, people did not learn from the past. If they had learned from the past, they would have seen what helped were houses that were on stilts. They got rid of these houses on stilts. But if they had learned from the past, they would have seen that the water, that the areas that are flooded, of course, are always the ones that are under the sea level, and that if they had learned from the past, they would know that dams will break. If they had learned from the past, they would have seen that originally there were shelters all over, and each about of a distance of 1 mile. They got rid of these shelters, so people couldn't flee. They had to all go to a stadium. If they had learned from the past, they would have known that the bus service helped people flee. And so, interestingly, a more recent catastrophe was worse than an earlier one. I think we can learn from the past for the future. But talking about flooding, Venice, we can't talk about Venice without flooding. And maybe you can tell us your impressions about the Acqua Alta, the high water that everybody was so concerned about in 2019. What is your perspective on that?
Well, indeed, the 2019 event in November and December, actually it was a sequence of events, but I was here. It was really a shocking event. I remember being at home with my family and listening to the news and trying to understand what was happening. And we had all these alert systems. We have on our mobile phones, we have apps showing up the tide, and it was really a case in which we had the perception that we could not understand what was happening. Something really completely strange. In fact, a small tornado appeared just in front of Venice and changed completely the behavior of the system, the system of Venice, which is made of a city, but is made of surrounding waters. So this is a classical example of a shock that goes beyond the capacity of the system to resist and what we call usually the coping capacity of a society to deal with the natural catastrophe. We used always to say that Venice, yes, is affected by Acqua Alta, by these tides, but people usually tend to think at flooding as something that appears and stays there for days, etc. While it's typically something that happens for hours, and we always have been repeating that this is in fact the case. We will see what will happen with mobile gates at the Moses system, but Venice has demonstrated for centuries to be resilient to this kind of stress, okay? What happened in 2019 raises some doubts about that, raises some doubts about the possibility of the city to be resilient to further shocks. And the COVID-19 is an example of a sequence. If we were in economics and we were thinking about the crisis, for example, of 2008 and the following years, we would describe this as a double dip. So a case in which we have a sequence of two shocks, and the second shock hits the system when the system is still affected by the previous one. I'm speaking in economic terms, of course, because the shocks are completely different. It's a shock that doesn't have the same environmental features, of course. So once more, we have to think about Venice as a system. And here, again, I have prepared a map, a picture showing maps overlaid on top of each other of possible understanding of Venice as a system. Because you have in red the city, yes, you have in pale blue the lagoon, and in front of it is the Adriatic Sea. But behind this, for example, in pale brown, you have the hydrologic boundaries of the system, because that is the watershed, a very strange shape, by the way, because it's a plain watershed. But then if you look at from a more a socioeconomic viewpoint, you see different colors that identifies, for example, the area of daily commuting from into the city, or the area where you have the most important economic relationships around sort of metropolitan area, so to say. So again, I take the opportunity of your question to repeat once more that we have to think at Venice also as a socio ecosystem. This system is evolving. If we want to think, for example, at Venice in purely, let's say, I would say ecological terms, we will see probably today Venice as the demonstration of a system that has gone towards a simplified setting. Simplification means losing diversity, and in economic terms it means the monoculture of tourism for Venice. And if you think in ecological terms, you know that all the systems that are affected by limited diversity, they are unstable systems. They are more exposed to shocks. So once more, I think that we have to really start thinking at Venice with a combination of multiple viewpoints. Hundreds of thousands of scholars have studied Venice. But unfortunately, I must say that the interdisciplinary, or as we say, transdisciplinary approaches are really very rare. And they are rare in the studies, and they are probably completely absent in the policies and the solutions that are proposed for saving Venice. So once more, I hope that our interest for environmental humanities, the study, etc., could take Venice to the relevance it has, not anymore as a place to show at the TV when there is a natural catastrophe, but also a place where we can show, demonstrate, study solution, and show to the rest of the world.
Oh, I wish that we could continue with this. I know you're not a prophet, and yet maybe you can say in a couple of sentences, just in 2 sentences or so, what do you expect this system to look like, let's say in 50 years or in 100 years? What's going to happen to Venice?
Well, this is a question that once more is not enough high in the attention of scholars and politicians here. We have, again, looking from a complexity science, we have a possible, as we call it, bifurcations or tipping points. And we do not have time to go into the details of this kind of interesting discussion, but think about sea level rise. What is the tipping point of sea level rise? When sea level rise will be simply too much for the city as it is at the moment. If we look at the IPCC reports, what is evident is that sooner or later, before the end of the century, we will reach some levels of rising sea that put really the city as it is under discussion. And a possible solution would be closing the connection of the lagoon and the sea. This would mean really a complete change, and this could happen in 50 years from now. So this, on the one hand, on one side, it's a frightening perspective, but I think we should approach this challenge with some sort of hope for the future. And by the way, you know that you know something about hope, right?
I have published a little book called Slow Hope, I mean, if I look out of the window and I think there's a picture of the river, of the Isar River, you know, this is what the Isar River in Munich looks like today. And just about 20 years ago, it was concrete. It was a canal. They had to build a canal in the 19th century because the bridges were the wooden bridges were torn down. They had to build stone bridges, and they narrowed the canal in order to avoid flooding in Munich. And now the river looks like this, and people are actually outside, and the water is cold, comes from the Alps, but people are swimming there. So there, in my opinion, this renaturalization of the river is an example of hope. But also, if you go back in Venetian history, go to the Arsenale. I visited the Arsenale with my doctoral students a long time ago. It was wonderful to be there. There's a historic picture of the Arsenale, and the Arsenale, where the ships were built, up to 1,000 ships every year in the 16th, 17th century, shows that wood was so important. I mean, without wood, there was no power. And the Venetians, you were talking about sustainability before. I think they are the inventors of sustainability. Mm-hmm. They actually, the Venetians were thinking about wood and how you can, if you don't have wood anymore, then you have no future, because then you have no ships and no power. And so they set aside not land, but they thought of time, and they asked themselves, how long does it take to grow trees to build these ships? So they were the inventors, in a way, of thinking in future times. But what they did, they only thought about economics and power. And today, and I think that gives me hope, and maybe we can show just a picture of a tree. What gives me hope is that we think differently about trees today. We have thought differently about forests. They are recreational. They can bind CO2. They go against erosion, against landslides. They have all sorts of other functions. And we have learned recently from Wohlleben and others that trees have a hidden life, and that trees are actually living creatures, that there's a wood wide web. And I think this all gives me hope to see that we are now thinking about trees not as something, that comes out of the forest, can be destroyed and used, not just as something recreational, but as fellow creatures. Mm-hmm. But Carlo, you just showed us, you were just going to show us a book, and this is something, I mean, we did discuss briefly that scientists and economists don't read books as much as humanities scholars. We have to read them. You have the pleasure, you can read them if you like. What book would you recommend to the people who are watching this video?
Yes, in fact, I was looking at the clock and see that, of course, it's a very nice discussion, but time is running. And I remember that we were asked also to give some suggestions about books, and I was trying to see if I can show the book or if I'm able to do so. And it's not easy, as you can see, for me. But this is a book about system science and modeling for ecological economics, written by Alexei Voinov. It's a very stimulating book, which I have actually in my hands. And I would recommend to read it. It is a book in which you can find most of the concepts that I mentioned during our conversation, but there are really very many books that I would like to recommend. Think about, for example, The Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows and others. This is 1972, still very stimulating, still very relevant. But if you want to stay more on literature, maybe also I had in mind, what came to my mind is a book by Maya Lunde, The History of Bees. So if you're not really interested in science, but you want to be stimulated about what could happen in the future, read that book and see where you would not like to end up in the future. and you, Christoph, if we have 2 more minutes, maybe can you tell us?
I like all sorts of books, and we've talked about floods and flooding. My favorite novel about flooding is The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood. And as an environmental historian, they're the old men. I mean, I'm an old man myself, so I can say that. I think some of these people, like Don Wood, who's written this wonderful book, Shrinking the Earth, Bill Cronin, Nature's Metropolis, then, of course, John McNeill, Mosquito Empire, all these, they're wonderful books that have been written. I love the books that my colleagues Alison Pulliot and Anat Singh have written about mushrooms. But I'm sitting here as a representative of the Rachel Carson Center, and if you ask, we were asked to just come up with one book. And one book that we really recommend, and if you haven't read it, I hope that most people have read it. It's been translated into dozens of languages. The one book, the Bible of our field, is of course Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I've got the original one, from 1962, and it's actually so. This is what it looks like inside. And it says here, man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. Well, I hope, one day we will probably do that. But I hope that our generation and the generations that we are raising will contribute to halting that and preventing that into the near future. And I've really enjoyed, Carla, I've really enjoyed our conversation. The Alps are between us. And we can't travel like we could before, and disciplinary boundaries are between us. But I hope that we will, meet soon, intellectually, but also physically, and also bring our students together in the near future. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
It was indeed a pleasure also for me, and as with your words, I think is the best way to conclude our, let's say, first conversation. So. See you soon, Christoph. Bye-bye.